You cannot be serious, Mom, Isabella Reyes said into her phone, her voice a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. With her other hand, she rummaged desperately through a half-unpacked suitcase. I have been back from Chicago for less than a day after 3 entire years. And you want me to go scrub floors in some gangster's palace? On the other end of the call, Rosa Reyes's tired voice was thin and laced with anxiety. The doctor's verdict on her pneumonia was absolute. She needed complete bed rest for no less than a week. My love, it is just for a short while, Rosa pleaded. The Castellano family has employed me for 2 decades. I cannot abandon them now, not when they are preparing for such a major event. Isabella bit her tongue, forcing back a torrent of frustrated words. She was 27 years old. She had a degree in nursing and had spent 3 years running from the memory of an abusive ex-husband. The very last place she wanted to be was inside the world of powerful, dangerous men. But the image of her mother's weak, pale face in their little Brooklyn apartment was a more compelling reason than any argument she could make. An old, faded scar on her shoulder began to ache, a phantom pain reminding her of the terrible cost of trusting the wrong man. "Isn't there anyone else you can call?" she asked, a final, hopeful plea, even though she already knew the answer. "Nobody knows that house the way we do, Bella," Rosa insisted. "And they trust me. They will trust you." Isabella stared out the window of their humble apartment. Far away, the brilliant towers of Manhattan shimmered, a constant, taunting symbol of the vast gulf that separated her life from the world of the Castellanos. "Fine," she finally conceded with a heavy sigh. "But I will not wear that hideous uniform you have. If I am going to clean their mansion, I will do it on my own terms." "Bella, please," Rosa begged, her words punctuated by a weak cough. "My terms or not at all, Mom. I am not the same scared girl who fled 3 years ago." The profound silence that followed was all the confirmation she required. A small smile touched Isabella's lips. She had at least won this minor conflict. But in her heart, she felt a tremor of fear, completely unaware that stepping inside the Castellano mansion was a choice that would alter the course of her entire life. She could not know that the notoriously cold Mafia boss, a man who had never yielded to anyone, was about to be completely disarmed by a woman wearing ripped jeans and carrying a defiance sharper than any blade. If you want to find out what unfolds when Isabella enters that mansion and stands before Maxwell Castellano, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. You should share this with anyone who enjoys a captivating enemies to lovers story. Don't go anywhere, because this is only the start of a romance that is guaranteed to make your pulse pound. This is a story about a woman who was told she was nothing and proved she was everything. It will remind you that the scars life gives us do not make us weaker, they make us untouchable. And sometimes the person you least expect will see the fire inside you when the rest of the world only sees the ashes. If you have ever rebuilt yourself from nothing, this one is for you. The following morning, her taxi pulled up to the imposing tall black iron gates of the Castellano property. Isabella emerged from the vehicle, casually throwing a worn backpack over her shoulder, and then she paused, utterly frozen by the sight of the colossal building that loomed before her. She had selected her clothes with deliberate care for her first day. She wore blue jeans with tears at the knees, a simple white t-shirt knotted at her midriff that exposed a sliver of skin, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders without any styling, and her face was bare of makeup, save for a light sheen of lip balm. This was not the attire of a cleaner, and she was well aware of it. Two men dressed in dark suits flanked the gate, their eyes raking over her with undisguised suspicion. "What is your business here?" one of them demanded, his tone devoid of any civility. Isabella raised her head, locking her gaze with his. "I am Isabella Reyes. I am Rosa Reyes's daughter, here to cover my mother's shifts for the week." The guard's eyebrow lifted in disbelief as his eyes scanned her outfit again. "Are you certain you are at the correct address?" he sneered, his mockery barely concealed. "The help here doesn't typically show up dressed like that." A flash of hot anger burned in Isabella's chest, but she suppressed it, offering him a placid smile instead. I cannot speak for how your maids normally dress, but I dress for myself. So, you can either call the house to verify who I am, or I can leave right now and let my mother know the Castellano residence will be without a cleaner this week. The guard paused, clearly surprised by her confident response. He shot a look at his partner before grudgingly picking up a phone to make the call. After a few long, tense moments, the massive iron gates began to swing inward. Isabella walked through, feeling the intense glare of both men on her back. A driveway of white gravel snaked through a vast manicured garden featuring flawless green lawns, fragrant rose bushes in full bloom, and strategically placed marble sculptures. Isabella fought to maintain a neutral expression, but internally, her mind was racing. Her mother had served here for 20 years, and yet Isabella had never once conceived of this level of extravagant wealth. The main house rose up ahead, a grand Italianate mansion with magnificent white columns, ornate ironwork on the balconies, and a huge door made of solid oak. Isabella ascended the marble stairs and was just reaching for the bell when the door swung open. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was stern, marked by pronounced lines around her mouth. She was dressed in a dark gray suit and held herself as straight as a soldier. "You must be Rosa's daughter," she stated, her words a declaration, not a question, as her penetrating eyes took in Isabella's entire appearance. "I am Margaret Stone. Though everyone calls me Maggie, I manage this household." Isabella simply nodded. "Yes, I am Isabella. My mother has mentioned you." Maggie offered no polite greeting in return, only stepping to the side. "Enter. The master wishes to speak with you before you start." Isabella crossed the threshold and was instantly overwhelmed, feeling as though she had stepped into a completely different reality. The entrance hall was immense, with a towering ceiling painted with stunning frescoes. A colossal crystal chandelier sparkled overhead, throwing patterns of brilliant light onto the polished black and white marble floors. The walls were covered with oil paintings in ornate gold frames, and she knew each piece was probably worth more than the entire apartment building she shared with her mother. Isabella swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. She followed Maggie down what felt like endless hallways, the sound of her own sneakers echoing on the cold, hard floor. Periodically, she saw men in black suits posted in corners and doorways, and she couldn't help but notice the distinct shape of firearms concealed under their jackets. This is not just some rich family, Isabella realized, remembering the strict rules her mother had drilled into her. Never inquire about the Castellano family's affairs. Never look at things that are not your concern, and above all, never repeat a single word you overhear. Maggie finally stopped in front of a heavy wooden door at the corridor's end. She faced Isabella, her expression impossible to decipher. "The master does not appreciate insubordination," she warned in a low voice. "You would be wise to reconsider your attire and your tone." Isabella managed a faint smile in response. "I am here as an employee, not as property." Maggie observed her for a long, silent moment before letting out a soft sigh and knocking on the door. A deep, masculine voice responded from within. "Come in." Maggie opened the door and moved aside, showing a spacious study. "Mr. Castellano," she announced. "This is Isabella Reyes, the daughter of Rosa." Isabella took a steadying breath and walked into the room, completely oblivious that this single step was about to irrevocably change her life. The study was even larger than she had anticipated. 3 of its walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves filled with books. A huge walnut desk sat commandingly in the room's center, and tall glass windows offered a view of the garden behind the house. But all of that opulent detail vanished from her mind the instant she saw the man at the desk. Maxwell Castellano was focused on a pile of papers, with one hand holding a pen and the other propping up his head. Standing near him was a powerfully built, middle-aged man who Isabella assumed was his bodyguard, while two other men stood perfectly still in the room's corners, like human statues. Max did not even glance up as she came in, his focus fixed on his work, as if her arrival was entirely beneath his notice. Isabella stood her ground in the center of the room, remaining silent and refusing to lower her gaze in submission. She observed him quietly. His dark hair was combed back from a face with strong, chiseled features, a firm jaw, and a subtle scar that traced a line from his temple down toward his mouth. He was wearing a white dress shirt, its sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and the open collar gave a glimpse of a dark tattoo on his skin. Even sitting perfectly still, he projected an intimidating aura of command that made the very air in the study feel dense and charged. This is the man, Isabella thought, that my mother has worked for 20 years. The very man rumored to have ended numerous lives without so much as a flinch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of charged silence, Max raised his head, his cold gray eyes locked with Isabella's. And then he went still. The pen in his hand paused just above the paper. For a split second, his eyes widened almost imperceptibly as they moved from her face, down her shoulders, to the knotted shirt at her waist, over her torn jeans, and all the way down to her worn-out sneakers. As his gaze lifted back to meet hers, Isabella saw a flicker of something in those gray depths, an emotion she could not identify. Whatever it was, it made her own heart jump in her chest. Max slowly placed the pen on his desk and leaned back into his leather chair, his intense stare never leaving her face. "You are Rosa's daughter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. It was a statement of fact, not a question. Isabella gave a small, confident nod. "Yes, Isabella Reyes. I am here to fill in for my mother for the week." Max just watched her. He remained quiet for a beat, his eyes continuing to scan her clothing with an inscrutable look. When he finally spoke, his voice was as cold as ice. "I value you coming to assist your mother, but this household has regulations you are expected to follow. That begins with you wearing the proper uniform." A surge of defiance warmed Isabella's chest, but she maintained a level tone. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Castellano. I am sorry, but I must inform you that I will not be putting on any uniform. My mother might agree to that, but I certainly will not." An unnerving stillness filled the entire room. The powerfully built guard next to Max, a man Isabella would later identify as Tony, gawked at her like she had sprouted a second head. The two men standing in the corner shot each other looks of pure disbelief. Nobody ever spoke to Don Castellano in that manner. Nobody had the nerve. Max rose slowly from his chair, and it was only then that Isabella grasped his immense height. He moved around his desk, every footfall on the hardwood floor sounding like a distant battle drum. He came to a stop barely a foot from her, looking down at her with glacial eyes. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" he inquired, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Isabella raised her chin to meet his gray gaze without flinching, even as her heart hammered inside her ribs. "I do," she answered with a steady voice. "You are Maxwell Castellano, the man who employs my mother, the one she has faithfully served for 20 years of her life. However, I am not my mother. I am here to do a job, not to be made into an ornament in a uniform. If that is something you cannot accept, I will leave this instant and you can find a replacement." Max's brow furrowed, and Isabella noticed the scar on his face twitch almost imperceptibly. He stared at her, seemingly trying to peer into her very soul. In that moment, his gaze dropped to her shoulder where her blouse had slipped, exposing the edge of a faded scar. His gray eyes went dark for a split second, but he made no comment on it. He simply turned to Tony and the other two men. "Leave us," he commanded, his tone permitting no discussion. "All of you. I need to have a word with her in private." Tony's mouth opened as if he might protest, but then he snapped it shut. He gave a sharp nod and escorted the others from the room, pulling the door closed on his way out. Isabella was now alone with the most infamous mafia leader in all of New York. and she couldn't help but wonder if she had just made the wisest or the most reckless decision of her entire life. As soon as the door clicked shut, a profound quiet settled over the space. Max remained where he was, standing less than a foot from Isabella, his cold gray eyes locked on her face, without a single blink. Isabella could smell his cologne, a mixture of sandalwood and something else she could not identify, something dangerous. She held her breath, waiting, completely unsure of what was about to happen. Then, without warning, Max pivoted and walked to the large window, standing with his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the garden. "You have courage," he remarked, his voice surprisingly more composed than Isabella had anticipated. "It has been a very long time since anyone has dared to address me in such a way." Isabella replied without a second of hesitation. "That is probably because no one dares to speak the truth to you." Max swiveled back around, and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. It was not a genuine smile, but it was no longer menacing. He strode over to his desk, poured a measure of whiskey into a glass and raised it. He did not drink, but instead swirled the amber liquid in his hand. "We have a major event in a few days," he stated, his attention still fixed on the glass. "It is the launch of my family's new collection of premium wines. Every single detail must be flawless. Your mother is the only person who is familiar with every part of this house, every preference of every attendee." He then looked up, directly at Isabella, and she is now in the hospital. "I do not have the time to find someone to take her place." Isabella saw it clearly. "So you require my help?" she stated plainly. Max placed the glass on the desk, his gaze becoming sharp. "I do not require anyone, but I will concede that your presence right now is essential. There is a distinction." Isabella let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "You can call it whatever you wish, but if you want me to remain here and work in the manner you need, then we are going to have to renegotiate." Max lifted an eyebrow. "Renegotiate?" Isabella nodded, stepping confidently toward his desk. She understood she was dancing with fire, but she had already survived 3 years on the run from a monstrous husband. She was not easily frightened anymore. "First, I will not be wearing a uniform," she declared, her voice ringing with clarity and conviction. "Second, I will perform my duties my own way, as long as the work meets your expectations. And third," she paused, looking him straight in the eye, "I want double my mother's salary." Max just stared at her, and Isabella could not decipher a single thought on his stony expression. Several long seconds of heavy silence ticked by. Then he laughed. It was a deep, guttural sound that filled the room. It was the very first laugh Isabella had ever heard from him, and it caught her completely off guard. "You are haggling with me," he said, a note of genuine amusement in his voice. "In my own home, over a position as a housekeeper." Isabella stood her ground. "I am presenting you with reasonable terms for a task you yourself have called essential. If you cannot agree to them, I am prepared to walk out that door immediately." Max inclined his head, observing her as if she were some fascinating new species he had never seen before. After a moment, he gave a slow nod. "Fine," he said, his voice decisive. "Double the pay. No uniform. Your methods." But then he moved closer, his voice dropping to a low pitch. "If a single thing at this event is anything less than perfect, you will answer for it. And I am not a man who forgives." Isabella swallowed hard but held her gaze firm. "I have no need for your forgiveness. I only need you to honor your commitment." Max observed her for another long moment before he stepped away and pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Maggie," he spoke into the device. "Please take Miss Reyes and brief her on the work. She will be filling in for Rosa this week." He paused, then shot a glance at Isabella. "And she will not require a uniform." Maggie's voice crackled through the speaker, audibly surprised but utterly professional. "Yes, sir." Max settled into his chair and took up his paperwork as if their entire exchange was concluded. But just as Isabella was about to turn and depart, she heard his voice from behind her. "You are an interesting woman, Isabella Reyes." She did not look back. She just allowed a small smile to touch her lips and walked away, her heart thumping against her ribs. She had just won another fight, but deep down, she understood that the real war had only just begun. Maggie guided Isabella through the vast mansion, pointing out each zone with a flat, detached tone. The kitchen was the size of a commercial kitchen in a five-star hotel, full of polished stainless steel appliances. The primary living area was vast enough for 100 guests, appointed with plush, cream-colored leather couches and a grand marble fireplace. The banquet hall on the lower level was more immense still, featuring stone pillars and a lustrous hardwood floor that shone like a dark mirror. Isabella took it all in, committing every detail to memory, her mind operating like a precise machine. 3 years working as a nurse had trained her to notice the smallest things, to organize her tasks with systematic efficiency, and to stay composed under any kind of pressure. When Maggie presented her with the checklist for the upcoming event, Isabella scanned it just once before nodding. "I will require 2 additional assistants to prepare the banquet hall," she informed Maggie. "Also, the entire chandelier array must be cleaned again. I can spot dust on the upper fixtures from down here." Maggie's eyebrows shot up in astonishment, but she kept her thoughts to herself, simply nodding and jotting it down. For the rest of that day, Isabella worked non-stop. She completely reorganized the storage for guest amenities, examined every piece of crystal glassware for nicks, compiled a list of supplies that needed to be restocked, and gave it to Maggie. She moved with speed and accuracy, never uttering a complaint, never wasting a single second. At first, the other household employees observed her with suspicion, but by the day's end, they were following her lead without question. In his private study, Max sat in front of his computer monitor, the business reports on his desk completely ignored. He was watching the feed from the security cameras, observing Isabella's every action. He watched as she stood in the banquet hall, issuing instructions as others positioned tables and chairs, her expression one of intense focus. He watched her lean down to examine a wine glass, raising it toward the light to check for any streaks before she nodded in approval. He watched her pull back her long, dark hair when it fell across her face, and he asked himself why he found it impossible to look away. She was unlike any woman he had ever known. She was not timid, not obedient, and not trying to win his favor. She looked at him as though he were just another person, not the feared Mafia don of the entire city. This fact both annoyed and captivated him. Max leaned back into his chair, his gaze still fixed on the screen, but his thoughts began to wander into his past. He thought of his brother, Jonathan, the one who was meant to be occupying this very seat instead of him. Jonathan was 3 years his senior, tall and confident, a natural-born leader destined to take over the Castellano family enterprise. Max, by contrast, had only ever dreamed of becoming a doctor. He could still recall the sleepless nights in his medical school dorm, surrounded by heavy anatomy textbooks, dreaming of how he would save lives, not end them. He had been in his final year, just months away from his graduation. That was when Jonathan was gunned down right in front of him, ambushed by a rival family. Max could still feel his brother's warm blood coating his hands. He could still hear Jonathan's last, shallow breath. He could still see his brother's eyes looking at him, trying to convey a final, silent message. On that day, Maxwell Castellano, the medical student with visions of healing people, ceased to exist. In his place rose Don Castellano, a cold man who never offered forgiveness and never forgot a transgression. He had hunted down Jonathan's killers one by one, showing no mercy, and he had buried his dream of being a doctor right alongside his brother's casket. Max blinked, forcing himself back to the present moment. On the monitor, Isabella was sharing a smile with an older housekeeper. It was the first time he had seen her smile since she walked into his home. That simple expression softened the strong lines of her face, making her appear younger, more approachable, and deep within Max's chest, a feeling he thought had died years ago began to stir. He abruptly shut off the monitor and turned back to his paperwork, trying to erase the image of Isabella from his thoughts. But the faint smell of her perfume seemed to hang in the air of his study, and he knew it was going to be a very long night. The calm of Isabella's second day shattered with the sound of an engine growling in the courtyard. She had just started to learn the rhythm of the mansion, the quiet flow of work that governed the estate. Down in the cellar, she was taking inventory of the wine collection. She ignored the noise at first, thinking it was just another delivery or a casual guest. But when she came upstairs to the grand living room, she stopped cold. A woman stood there, a vision of perfection. Her golden hair was sculpted into flawless curls. Her makeup was immaculate. A tight, expensive red dress clung to her slender frame, and her arms were wrapped around Max's neck, her crimson lips pressed against his cheek. Max just stood there, his body rigid, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides as if he had no idea what to do with them. "Darling," the woman's voice was high and sugary sweet. "I have missed you so desperately. Why did you not call me all week?" Max carefully unwrapped her arms from his neck, his face a mask of cold stone. "Vanessa," he said, his voice flat. "I was busy with preparations for the event." Vanessa's perfect lips formed a slight pout. "Too busy for your fiancé?" The word hit Isabella like a blast of freezing water. His fiancé. Of course. She felt a bitter sting in her chest. A man with the power of Maxwell Castellano would never be alone. She tried to retreat silently, to fade back into the shadows, but it was too late. Vanessa turned, and her icy blue eyes locked onto Isabella's. In a single sweeping glance, she took in everything, from Isabella's simple dark ponytail to her plain white shirt and jeans. "And who is this?" Vanessa asked. Her tone was still sweet, but it now had an edge of ice that made Isabella's skin crawl. Max's gaze shifted to Isabella, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his gray eyes before it disappeared. "This is Isabella Reyes," he stated calmly. "She is Rosa's daughter. She is filling in for her mother this week." Vanessa arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow, her stare still pinned on Isabella. "Oh, the help's daughter," she said, her voice slow and dripping with disdain. "I was under the impression that the staff had uniforms. Why is she dressed like she is one of the guests?" A hot surge of anger rose in Isabella's chest, but she pushed it down and managed a polite smile. "I am not a servant, ma'am. I am just helping my mother while she recovers from an illness." Vanessa glided closer, and the sharp, heavy scent of her perfume assaulted Isabella's senses. She was taller in her high heels, and she used the advantage to look down on Isabella with pure contempt. "Whatever you are," Vanessa whispered, her voice low enough so that only Isabella could hear, "you need to remember your place. Do not ever think a pretty face gives you permission to look at things that will never belong to you." Isabella held Vanessa's gaze, refusing to back down. "I have no idea what you are referring to," she replied, her own voice steady and calm. "I am only here to do my job, not to look at anything." Vanessa let out a short, brittle laugh, but her eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "Good," she said. "Make sure you keep it that way." She then pivoted back to Max, her charming smile instantly reappearing, as though their tense exchange had never occurred. "Darling," she cooed, sliding her arm possessively through his. "I want to see everything you have planned for the party. My father is so excited for this event." Max gave a slight nod, but his eyes darted one last time toward Isabella before he let Vanessa pull him away down the long corridor. Isabella remained rooted to the spot, watching them until they vanished from sight. She could not understand the sharp ache in her heart or why she cared at all that Maxwell Castellano was engaged. She was just the maid's daughter, a temporary replacement who would be gone in a few days. She had no right to feel anything for a mafia boss, and she certainly should not. Yet, as she forced herself to return to her tasks, the image of Vanessa's possessive arm looped through Max's continued to burn in her mind. That afternoon, Vanessa announced she would be staying for dinner. She settled into the living room, sipping wine and issuing commands as if she were already the lady of the manor. Isabella did her best to stay clear of the woman, focusing on the massive preparations for the event. But Vanessa seemed determined not to let her be. "You there?" Vanessa's voice cut across the room as Isabella walked by carrying a heavy stack of fresh tablecloths. "Come over here." Isabella halted, drawing in a long, steadying breath before turning and walking toward her. "Yes, what can I do for you?" she asked, her tone polite but unmistakably chilly. Vanessa's eyes raked over her with undisguised scorn. "Pour me another glass of wine," she commanded, shoving her empty glass across the small table toward Isabella. Isabella glanced at the glass, then met Vanessa's gaze. "There are staff members in the kitchen who can help you," she answered evenly. "I am quite busy with the event setup." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, and her red lips thinned into a hard line. "I told you to pour my wine. Are you hard of hearing?" Isabella placed the tablecloths on a nearby table, walked to the wine bar, and poured a glass of the deep red wine. She set it down in front of Vanessa, fighting to keep her expression neutral, even though her blood was beginning to boil. Vanessa picked up the glass, took a delicate sip, and then, with a sudden flick of her wrist, she hurled the contents all over Isabella. The cold, red liquid drenched her white shirt, soaking through to her skin. Isabella stood there, completely frozen, unable to process what had just happened. "Oh, my apologies," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "My hand must have slipped. But it is no problem. You must be used to being dirty, are you not? Your mother is the same, spending her entire life on her knees scrubbing floors for other people." Isabella's hands clenched into tight fists, her nails digging painfully into her palms. She felt her face flush with heat as rage roared in her ears. But she forced herself to stand still, thinking of her mother and the 20 years she had dedicated to this house. Seeing Isabella's silence only seemed to fuel Vanessa's cruelty. She rose from her chair and stepped closer, her voice becoming even more poisonous. "I heard your mother is sick," she sneered. "It is probably because she worked herself to ruin like a common servant. How truly pitiful. 20 years of bowing and scraping. And for what? In the end, she is just some old maid that nobody needs anymore." At that moment, something inside Isabella finally snapped. She could take any insult directed at her, but she would not stand for one against her mother. Without a single thought, Isabella's hand shot out, and the sharp crack of her palm connecting with Vanessa's perfect cheek echoed through the silent room. Vanessa stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. You actually hit me!" she shrieked, her voice piercing the air. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Isabella stood tall, her chest heaving with fury, her voice as cold as ice. "She struck me, Maxwell." Max's gaze remained fixed on Isabella, completely ignoring Vanessa. "Tony," he repeated, his voice even colder now. "Do what I said." Tony nodded and, with a gentle but unyielding grip, began to escort Vanessa out of the room, disregarding her shrill and furious protests. Once the room was silent and they were alone, Max strode toward Isabella. "Follow me," he said, his tone short, before turning and heading down the corridor. Isabella hesitated for only a second before she followed him. He led her into his private study and shut the heavy door behind them. She stood there, steeling herself for the rage she was sure was about to be unleashed. Instead, Max just looked at her with an unreadable expression. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a new white shirt still in its packaging, and held it out to her. "Change your shirt," he said simply. "If the wine stays on your skin for too long, it will cause irritation." Isabella stared at the shirt, then back at him, utterly bewildered. "You are not going to punish me?" she asked. Max turned away from her and stared out the large window. "Next time, do not leave a handprint on her face," he said, and she could hear a faint trace of amusement in his voice. "It makes things difficult to explain to the Thornon family." Isabella stood there in absolute shock, staring at the wide expanse of his back. And for the very first time since setting foot in this mansion, She felt a sliver of warmth spread through her chest. That night, Isabella lay awake on the small, narrow bed in the servants' quarters, unable to quiet her mind. The events of the day played over and over again. The slap that she had delivered to Vanessa's face. Max's completely unexpected reaction. She did not understand him at all. She could not comprehend why he had shielded her instead of punishing her. She could not decipher the strange look in his eyes when he gave her the clean shirt. When the old clock in the hall chimed 2 in the morning, Isabella finally gave up on sleep. She pulled on a thin cardigan and slipped quietly out of her room. The mansion was submerged in a deep, silent darkness, broken only by a few dim lights along the corridors. She did not know where she was going. Her feet seemed to move on their own, carrying her through the deserted hallways until she found herself standing before the heavy door that led down to the wine cellar. After a brief pause, she decided to go inside. A winding stone staircase took her down into a huge, cavernous space lined with what seemed like endless rows of oak shelves. The air was thick with the rich scent of aged wood and fermenting grapes. Isabella walked slowly, letting her fingertips trail across the dusty bottles. Each one felt like it held a piece of the Castellano family's history, a memory trapped in glass. She stopped suddenly when she saw a silhouette at the far end of the cellar. Max was sitting by himself in an old leather armchair. Beside him, on a small table, was an open bottle of wine and a glass filled with a dark red liquid. But what truly stunned Isabella was not his presence, but the object in his other hand. Even in the faint light, she could see it was a medical textbook, the kind she had become so familiar with during her nursing studies. "You cannot sleep either." Max's voice cut through the stillness, making Isabella jump. He had not looked up from his book, but he had clearly been aware of her arrival for some time. With no reason to retreat, Isabella moved closer. "I could say the same thing to you," she replied softly. Max finally raised his head, and his gray eyes found hers in the deep shadows. He looked more tired than he had during the day. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, and the coldness she was used to seeing was replaced by a profound sadness. "I have not had a good night's sleep in many months," he admitted, his voice rough, "not since Jonathan passed away." Isabella recalled Maggie mentioning the name. Jonathan was Max's brother, the man who was supposed to be the heir to the entire Castellano empire. She quietly took a seat in the armchair across from him, remaining silent, giving him space to speak. Max observed her for a long moment before he lifted the book. "This belonged to my brother," he explained. Jonathan had a collection of medical books, even though he never wanted to become a doctor. He used to say they helped him understand the human body, where to inflict the maximum amount of pain. A short, cold laugh escaped him. "But I was the one who actually wanted to use that knowledge to heal people." Isabella stared at him as everything suddenly made sense. "You went to medical school," she realized, saying it as a fact, not a question. Max gave a slow nod. "I was in my final year, just a couple of months away from graduating. Then Jonathan was murdered right in front of me, and I had to come back to take his place." His voice was flat, like he was telling a story about someone else. But Isabella saw the profound agony swimming in his gray eyes. She knew that emptiness intimately, the feeling of losing someone you love and carrying a void that never truly fills. "I lost my brother too," she said, her voice still fragile after all this time. "His name was Miguel. He was 16. He died in a crash on his motorcycle, making deliveries to help our family. I was holding him in my arms when he died." Max turned to her and, for the very first time, his expression was completely unguarded, with no walls left standing. "How old were you when it happened?" he asked her. 18, Isabella answered quietly. "He passed away the day right before my birthday. I have not celebrated with candles on a cake since that day." They sat together in a deep silence for a long time. They were two people from completely separate worlds, but in that moment, they were connected by a shared, deep-seated grief. Max poured her another glass of wine and pushed it gently across the table to her. She accepted it and took a small sip, the taste of ripe fruit and oak wood spreading across her tongue. Jonathan would have really liked you, Max said out of nowhere. He was always drawn to people who were not afraid. Isabella looked up at him from over the edge of her glass. I am not fearless, she told him with complete honesty. The truth is, I have spent so much of my life being terrified that I no longer have any energy left for fear. Max watched her with a peculiar look on his face, as if her words had struck a chord deep inside of him. They remained there until the wine bottle was completely empty, talking about the people they had lost, about dreams they had to bury, and about the scars that no one else could see. And as the first light of dawn started to creep in through the cellar door, Isabella knew she had witnessed an entirely different version of Maxwell Castellano, a man carrying unhealed wounds behind his cold mask, and that realization scared her more than anything had before. The morning light was growing brighter through the gaps in the cellar door when Max suddenly put his glass down and looked directly at Isabella. That scar on your shoulder, he began, his voice quiet but unyielding. I noticed it the day you first arrived. Who gave it to you? Isabella went completely still. Her hand instinctively went to her shoulder, covering the spot where the long, thin scar was hidden by her clothing. She was so used to concealing it, so accustomed to acting like it was not even there. But Max's gray eyes held an unusual patience, as if he would wait all day for her to answer. That is a very old story, she said softly, hoping to deflect the question. It really does not involve anyone else. Max did not say a word, he just continued to stare at her. His quiet stillness was more demanding than any question could have been. Isabella felt the protective wall she had spent 3 long years constructing begin to fracture. Maybe it was because they had shared so much during the night. Or maybe it was because she was just so exhausted from holding it all inside. My ex-husband, she finally confessed, her voice shaking just a little no matter how hard she tried to keep it steady. His name is Derek Manning. We got married when I was 22 and we were divorced 2 years after that. Max's brow furrowed, and the scar on his own face seemed to tighten. He hit you, he stated, not asking a question, but declaring an infuriated truth. Isabella nodded slowly, her gaze falling to her empty wineglass. In the beginning, it was just cruel words, she said, her tone detached as if narrating a film. Then it became slaps, and then it became beatings. This scar came from when he threw me into the corner of a glass table. It took 12 stitches to close the wound. Max's hand tightened into a fist, his knuckles turning completely white. Where is he now? He demanded, his voice as cold as ice, a deep rage boiling just beneath the surface. Isabella simply shook her head. I have no idea. After the divorce was final, I fled to Chicago and I cut off every single connection. For 3 years, I lived like I did not exist. No social media presence, no contact with old friends, leaving absolutely no trail. I was terrified that he would find me. She raised her head to look at Max, and in her dark brown eyes, he saw something that was not weakness. It was a strength that had been forged in terrible suffering. But I am finished with running, she declared, her voice growing stronger. I returned to New York because my mother needs my help, and I will not allow anyone, especially not Derek, to force me out of my own life ever again. Max watched her for a long, silent moment, his gray eyes swirling with emotions she could not begin to understand. Then he got to his feet and moved closer to her. Isabella thought he was about to say something, but instead he just held out his hand, his palm facing up in a quiet gesture. Let us go upstairs, he said with a gentle voice. Morning is here and you need to get some sleep. Isabella looked down at his offered hand, paused for only a second, and then she placed her own hand in his. Max's hand felt warm and strong, and his fingers wrapped around hers with a gentleness that caught her by surprise. He guided her up the dark staircase and through the hallways that were still filled with morning shadows, all the way to the door of her room. Sleep, he instructed softly, and do not worry about a single thing. Isabella nodded and went inside her room. When she turned back around to say thank you, her door was already shut, and Max had disappeared down the long corridor. She had no way of knowing that the very second he was out of her sight, Max pulled out his phone and made a call to Tony. His voice was cold and deadly when he issued his command. I need you to find everything on a man by the name of Derek Manning, who is Isabella Reyes's ex-husband. I want to know his location, his job, how he even breathes. And I want all of that information before the sun goes down today. On the other end of the line, Tony did not ask any questions. After working for the Castellanos for 20 years, he understood when it was time to be silent and simply follow orders. Yes, sir, Tony confirmed. I will get on it immediately. Max hung up and stood alone in the dark hallway, his gray eyes fixed on the wood of Isabella's door. He did not understand why her story had ignited such a powerful rage inside of him. He did not know why the idea of someone laying a hand on her made him want to crush that person himself. He only knew that Derek Manning, no matter where he was hiding, was about to discover that he had harmed someone he never, ever should have touched. Later that afternoon, Isabella requested permission from Maggie to go visit her mother for a couple of hours. She felt a desperate need to see Rosa, to listen to her voice, and to feel the calm that only her mother's presence could provide. The last few days had been filled with too much chaos. Everything from Vanessa to the long nights in the wine cellar with Max had left her feeling like she was slowly losing her balance. The tiny apartment in Brooklyn was exactly as she remembered it. It was small but filled with warmth, with family pictures covering the walls and the comforting smell of cooking drifting from the kitchen. Rosa was doing much better. Her healthy color had come back, although she still had a cough every now and then. My dear daughter, Rosa said with a smile when she saw Isabella walk in. Come here and sit with me. Tell me all about how things are going over at the Castellano mansion. Isabella took a seat next to her mother on the old, worn-out sofa, and she rested her head on Rosa's shoulder, just like she did when she was a little girl. She talked about her duties, the big event that was coming up, and about Maggie and the other people on staff. She did not bring up Vanessa, she did not talk about the slap, and she definitely did not mention the nights she spent in the wine cellar with Max. But Rosa was her mother. She had always been able to understand the things that were left unsaid. Is there something else you need to tell me? Rosa asked in a gentle voice, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. Isabella paused for a moment, and then she shook her head. It is nothing, Mom. I am just really tired. Rosa let out a soft sigh, and her eyes seemed to look far away. I can tell that you are keeping something from me, she said, but that is okay. You have every right to hold on to your own secrets. It is just, I believe it is finally time that I tell you a secret I have been keeping for 20 years. Isabella lifted her head, completely surprised. What secret could you have? Rosa shut her eyes for a second, as if trying to find the courage she needed. When she opened them again, Isabella could see tears forming in the corners. It is about your father, Rosa said with a shaky voice, and it is the real reason I have worked for the Castellano family for the last 20 years. Isabella felt herself freeze. Her father, Ricardo Reyes, was the man who had walked out on them when she was only 5 years old, leaving her mother to raise 2 children all by herself in poverty. She had almost no memory of him, other than a couple of old photographs and the sound of her mother weeping late at night in the kitchen. Did you know that your father used to work for the Castellanos? Rosa asked. Isabella shook her head, completely shocked. I had no idea. You never said a word about it. Rosa nodded her head slowly. Your father was the personal driver for Mr. Castellano, who was Maxwell's father. He was very trusted and respected, but then he started to gamble and ended up losing a very large amount of money. He had to borrow from loan sharks, and when he was unable to pay them back, he did something that was truly unforgivable. Isabella felt her heart begin to pound in her chest, as a terrible feeling started to grow. What did he do? She asked, her voice a raw whisper. Rosa took a shaky breath, tears carving paths down her cheeks. Your father took money from the Castellanos to cover his gambling debts. It was an enormous amount of money. When they found out, he was supposed to die. But I got on my knees and pleaded with Mr. Castellano to show mercy. He finally agreed, but there was one condition. Your father had to vanish from our lives completely, and I had to work to pay back every last cent. Isabella felt the air leave her body in a rush. 20 years, she breathed. You worked for 2 decades to pay for what he did. Rosa nodded, the tears now flowing without restraint. I never hated your father for it, she said. My only goal was to shield you and your brother. I refused to let you grow up under the weight of that life. I did all of it so you could be normal, so you could go to school, so you could have a real future. Isabella stumbled to her feet and grabbed the window frame, just to keep herself from falling. For all those years, she had simply thought they were poor. She believed her mother worked herself to the bone because they had no other option. Isabella never imagined that Rosa was carrying a soul-crushing debt, a burden that should have belonged to her father. Every sacrifice her mother made, every single night she returned home with blistered hands and an aching spine, was for the man who had walked out on them without a single goodbye. Why did you never tell me? Isabella demanded as she turned around, her voice cracking with pain. Why did you carry this all by yourself for 20 years? Rosa stood up and wrapped her daughter in a tight embrace. Because you are my child, she whispered into her hair. There is nothing I would not do to keep you safe. And at that moment, Isabella finally shattered. She wept for the first time in many, many years, collapsing like a little girl in her mother's arms. She wept for Rosa's 2 decades of silent suffering, for her brother who was gone, for her own failed marriage, and for that 5-year-old child who used to stare out the window, waiting for a father who was never coming home. Rosa just held her, stroking her hair like she always had. It is all going to be okay, she murmured. We still have each other, and that is what matters more than anything. That evening, Isabella made her way back to the Castellano property, her eyes still puffy and red from crying. She had spent the entire afternoon in the safety of her mother's arms, and now she just felt empty, like a jar that had been poured out. Her only plan was to sneak back to her room without anyone noticing her condition. But the moment she stepped inside the massive front door, a cheerful voice stopped her cold. Oh, you have to be Isabella, am I right? Isabella turned to see a young woman standing at the base of the grand staircase. She appeared to be around 20 years old, with dark brown hair chopped to her shoulders and the exact same gray eyes as Max, though hers were much warmer. She was dressed in a baggy hoodie and worn-out jeans, looking more like a typical university student than the sister of a powerful crime boss. My name is Sophia, the girl said, moving closer with a radiant smile. I am Maxwell's sister. He mentions you quite a lot. Isabella was genuinely taken aback. He talks about me? Sophia let out a little laugh. Yes, he does. In his own unique way, of course. He never says much directly, but I have learned how to understand his silences. He told me someone new was working here, someone stubborn who was not afraid of anyone. I knew immediately that he was talking about a person who was very special. Isabella had no idea how to respond. She had never encountered anyone from the Castellano family who was so welcoming. Sophia was the complete opposite of Max's icy demeanor and the formal distance kept by everyone else in the house. Are you all right? Sophia's tone suddenly grew concerned. Your eyes look very sore. Isabella wanted to lie, but she could only manage to shake her head. Today was just a little difficult, she confessed quietly. Sophia nodded with empathy, and then, without warning, she took Isabella's hand. Come with me, she insisted, gently pulling her toward the kitchen. There is no problem in the world that a good cup of hot chocolate cannot make better. They sat together in the kitchen for almost an hour, sipping the warm chocolate and talking about everything and nothing. Sophia shared her experiences studying law and her dream of one day becoming an attorney who defends the rights of children. She spoke about how much she despised the dark cloud of the Castellano family name, yet how she loved her brother with all her heart. As Isabella listened, she felt the heavy weight on her chest begin to lift. There was an energy about Sophia that made her feel secure, like she had discovered a real friend in this strange and intimidating place. Max has been different since you arrived, Sophia said out of the blue. I visit home all the time, and I have never seen him act this way. He seems gentler, not so cold. I am not sure what you did, but I want to thank you. Isabella started to protest, but Maggie walked into the kitchen right at that moment. She stopped when she saw them, and an extremely rare smile touched her stern lips. Sophia is correct, Maggie stated, her voice much softer than usual. I have been here for 20 years since Max was just a boy. I saw him transform into the hard man he is today after Jonathan died. But over the last few days, I have noticed something shifting inside of him, and I am certain that change is you. Isabella felt her heart begin to beat faster in her chest. She did not know what to say or how she was supposed to feel about that. Sophia gave her hand a reassuring squeeze and smiled warmly. You are going to stay, are you not? After the wine launch is over, you will stay here with us. Isabella thought about her mother and the crushing 20-year debt. She thought about the terrible history she had only just learned. She thought about Derek and the constant fear that had been her shadow for 3 long years. Then she thought about Max, about his cold gray eyes that seemed to hide a pain that was so much like her own. She had spent too much of her life running. She was running from Derek, from her past, and from herself. Maybe this was the time to finally stop and face everything head on. I will stay, Isabella heard herself say, her voice stronger than it had been in years, at least until everything becomes clear. Sophia let out a happy cheer and threw her arms around her in a tight hug. Maggie just gave a slight nod, but in the older woman's eyes, Isabella saw a spark of hope that she had not witnessed in a very long time. The day of the wine launch party finally came. The Castellano estate had been transformed into a vision of pure elegance, lit by thousands of softly glowing candles. Arrangements of white roses were placed everywhere, and a live orchestra played gentle classical music that drifted through the grand banquet hall. Isabella had been working since the early morning, conducting final checks on every detail. She oversaw everything from the arrangement of the tables and chairs to the precise angle of the rare wine bottles on display. She was determined to make sure there was not a single flaw, not just because it was her job, but because she needed to prove to herself that she was capable. In the middle of the afternoon, while Isabella was reviewing the guest list one last time, Sophia burst in and pulled her toward one of the bedrooms. You cannot possibly wear jeans to the party tonight, Sophia declared with excitement. Max has invited you to attend as his personal guest. Isabella froze in place. What? I am just a temporary employee. I cannot possibly do that. Sophia simply waved her hand dismissively. The decision has been made, and when Maxwell Castellano decides something, nobody can change his mind. Besides, I have already picked out a dress. Before Isabella had a chance to argue, Sophia presented a long black gown from the wardrobe. The dress was simple but incredibly elegant, featuring a graceful bateau neckline and long sleeves made of delicate, sheer lace. It was fitted through the torso before flaring out gently at the bottom. I purchased it for a university formal, but I never ended up wearing it, Sophia explained. We are about the same size, so I am sure it will fit you perfectly. Isabella stared at the beautiful dress, then back at Sophia, feeling a wave of emotion clog her throat. She was not accustomed to this kind of care. She was not used to people being genuinely kind without expecting something in return. Thank you, Sophia, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia just smiled and gently nudged her toward the bathroom. Go on and get ready. We only have 2 hours before it starts. 2 hours later, Isabella looked at her reflection in the mirror and could hardly believe it was her. The black gown fit as if it were made for her, accentuating her warm skin tone and graceful curves. Sophia had skillfully applied some light makeup, just a bit of mascara, a hint of blush, and a soft nude lipstick. Her long, dark hair had been styled in an elegant updo, which revealed her slender neck and the beautiful pearl earrings that Sophia had insisted she borrow. "You look absolutely stunning," Sophia said, beaming with pride. "Max is not going to be able to look away from you." Isabella felt a blush creep up her neck, but remained silent. She just took one final deep breath and walked out of the room. The main staircase was already filled with people when Isabella appeared at the very top. She glanced down at the enormous hall below, where hundreds of impeccably dressed guests were chatting and enjoying glasses of wine. She saw a few familiar faces from television news reports, including powerful business tycoons and politicians, and she assumed the others were part of the criminal underworld. This is the world Max lives in, she realized. It was a place of dangerous glamour where she had never belonged. As Isabella started to walk down the staircase, Max happened to look up. In that precise instant, his gray eyes located her among the sea of people, and he stopped moving completely. She watched the wineglass freeze halfway to his lips and saw his mouth open slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no sound emerged. He was dressed in a sharp black three-piece suit with a crisp white shirt and a black silk tie, projecting the image of a king presiding over his court. And yet, in that single moment as their gazes locked, Isabella did not see the intimidating Mafia leader. She saw the man who had sat with her in the wine cellar, sharing a bottle of wine and listening to her painful story without a single ounce of judgment. Max placed his glass on a nearby table and moved to the bottom of the stairs, extending his hand to her like a perfect gentleman. "You look absolutely beautiful," he said in a low tone, his voice sounding deeper than it normally did. Isabella put her hand into his, feeling an immediate warmth spread from his touch through her entire body. "Thank you for including me tonight," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady even though her heart was pounding in her chest. Max did not say another word. He simply led her toward the center of the vast ballroom. Every single head in the room turned to watch them, and whispers began to circulate. But Isabella paid them no mind. She focused completely on the feeling of Max's strong hand holding hers, as if he was making a silent announcement to everyone that she was with him. From a dark corner of the opulent room, Vanessa Thornton watched everything, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the cold hatred burning in her blue eyes. For the first few hours, the celebration was a picture of perfection. Guests moved gracefully between conversations, their laughter mixing with the clinking of glasses filled with the Castellano family's most exquisite wines. Isabella remained close to Max's side, where he introduced her to his business associates simply as a friend of the family. She felt the weight of many curious, sometimes startled glances, but no one was bold enough to ask about her true identity. Maxwell Castellanos' power was so immense that his choices were never questioned. Vanessa was also there, attached to the arm of her father, George Thornton, a man considered one of the Castellanos' oldest allies. She continuously sent daggers toward Isabella with her gaze, but Isabella refused to let it affect her. She had grown accustomed to Vanessa's animosity and was determined not to let it spoil her evening. Just as the night reached its midpoint, Max made his way onto the small, elevated stage at the front of the great hall. The overhead lights began to fade. A single spotlight found him, and a hush fell over the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Max started, his powerful voice filling the space with ease. "Tonight, it is my great honor to introduce you to the new source of Castellano pride, our Rosadoro wine line, which has been crafted from the most exceptional grapes from our family's Tuscan vineyard. But before we all toast to Rosadoro, I have something even more extraordinary to offer you. It is a bottle that has rested in our family cellar for 100 years, awaiting an occasion significant enough for it to be opened." Max made a small gesture, and Tony appeared on stage, carefully carrying an ancient dust-covered bottle protected within a glass display case. A wave of appreciative murmurs washed over the crowd. Every person there understood the incredible value of a century-old wine, not just in terms of money, but in its historical significance. Max very deliberately uncorked the bottle and poured a small measure into a crystal glass, holding it up to inspect its color before he would taste it. Isabella watched from the floor below as he raised the glass toward the light, giving it a gentle swirl. It was then she noticed his expression suddenly shift. Max's brow furrowed, and he brought the glass to his nose. After taking a tiny sip, his gray eyes grew dark, and his jaw muscles clenched. Something was terribly wrong. Isabella felt a knot of dread form in her stomach as Max placed the glass back down, his face now as cold and hard as marble. "The wine is ruined," he said to Tony, his voice so low that Isabella could only just hear it from her position near the stage. A muscle in Max's jaw pulsed, but then a flash of calculated coldness appeared in his eyes. He had watched Vanessa on the security monitor hours before, yet he had intentionally allowed this sabotage to occur. In truth, the authentic century-old vintage had been secured in his private safe much earlier. The bottle on the stage was nothing more than a decoy. Max had orchestrated this entire scene specifically to draw Vanessa into his trap. He permitted the destruction of a worthless bottle to create this public forum where he could finally tear the mask away from the Thorntons and demonstrate to the entire world that Isabella was now under his unwavering protection. Someone has tampered with it. Before the tension could escalate, a shrill voice cut through the nervous quiet of the crowd. "I know who is responsible." Vanessa strode forward, her face alight with a look of pure triumph. "I saw her," she declared, pointing a finger directly at Isabella. "The maid's daughter was sneaking around the cellar late last night. She must have done something to the bottle." Every single head in the room swiveled to face Isabella. She felt the blood drain from her face, and a ringing noise filled her ears from the sheer shock and fury of the accusation. She had not done it. While she had been in the cellar with Max that evening, she had never laid a hand on any of the bottles. "That is a lie," Isabella stated, her voice remarkably firm even as her entire world began to spin. "I did not do anything." Vanessa offered a cold, dismissive smile. "Oh, is that so? Then perhaps you can explain what you were doing in the cellar at 2 o'clock in the morning?" She addressed the audience, her voice rising with practiced drama. "Everyone in this room knows exactly who she is. She is the daughter of the Maid, the one whose father stole from the Castellano family before he vanished. It seems that betrayal is a trait that runs in their blood." The words felt like a physical blow across Isabella's face. Vanessa knew the story of her father. She had no idea how, but at that moment, it did not matter. Her deepest secret had been exposed in front of hundreds of people, and there was nothing she could do to deny it. A few guests started to whisper among themselves, their suspicious and disdainful glances falling upon her. She was suddenly an island in an ocean of strangers, and the feeling of loneliness and utter helplessness was a tightening band around her throat. She desperately wanted to scream that she was innocent, and that Vanessa was twisting the truth, but she knew that nobody would ever believe a person like her. Vanessa pressed her advantage, her voice filled with a growing sense of victory. "She is jealous of my status, and she wants to ruin the Castellano family to get revenge for her father. She needs to be thrown out of here right now, or even better, punished in the way the Castellanos handle their traitors." Isabella's eyes found Max, who remained on the stage, perfectly still. His face was a mask, showing no trace of emotion. His gray eyes coolly scanned the unfolding scene as if he were merely analyzing data points. She had no idea what he was thinking. She could not know if he believed Vanessa's lies. She only knew that if he did, her life was effectively over tonight. And in that terrifying instant, Isabella understood that she was utterly and completely alone. Max's silence stretched out, feeling as long as a century. Isabella just stood there, feeling like she was sinking under the weight of judging eyes from every direction in the ballroom. She had the urge to flee, to simply vanish from this place, but her feet felt as if they were bolted to the marble floor. A few feet away, Vanessa's triumphant smile widened across her crimson lips. Just behind her, George Thornton maintained a grim expression, a clear sign of his support for his daughter's accusations. Isabella felt the room closing in on her, with absolutely no path of escape. Then Max spoke, and it seemed as though the entire room held its breath. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice quiet and level, as if he were merely commenting on the weather instead of addressing a grave act of sabotage. "You are certain you saw Miss Reyes sneaking into the cellar last night?" Vanessa nodded with great enthusiasm, her blue eyes shining, now fully convinced that Max was taking her side. "Yes, I saw her with my own eyes. She went down into the cellar at approximately 2 in the morning. Who can say what she did to your family's precious wine bottles?" Max gave a slow nod, then signaled to Tony. Tony came forward again, this time holding a digital tablet. He passed it to Max, who immediately turned the screen to face the crowd. "This entire estate is equipped with the most advanced security camera system available," Max said calmly, but there was a dangerous edge hidden beneath every single word. "Every last corner of this house is under surveillance 24 hours a day, and that most certainly includes the wine cellar." Vanessa's expression began to shift. Isabella watched as the victorious smirk dissolved, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. "This is the security recording from the cellar last night," Max continued, and then he pressed play. The screen displayed grainy black and white images from inside the cellar. Isabella watched herself as she walked down the stairs, then paused when she saw Max sitting at the far end of the room. She watched the recording of them talking, sharing a glass of wine, and then leaving the cellar together. At no point in the video did she touch a single bottle on the racks, other than the one that Max had already opened for them. "But this is where it gets interesting," Max announced as he fast-forwarded the footage. The video jumped ahead to show the empty cellar at 4 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly, a new figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was Vanessa Thornton. A wave of gasps and murmurs spread through the hall. On the screen, Vanessa crept down into the cellar, glancing around nervously to ensure she was alone before she approached the wine rack. She retrieved the century-old bottle, uncorked it, and carefully poured the contents of a small vial inside. Then she resealed it, placed it back in its original position, and vanished as quietly as she had arrived. "No!" Vanessa shrieked, her face completely white. "That is not real. That video is a fabrication. You manipulated it to shield that woman." Max placed the tablet on a nearby table and descended from the stage, every footstep echoing in the suffocating silence. The crowd parted for him as he walked, guests moving away from him instinctively. He came to a halt in front of Vanessa, his gaze cold enough to freeze fire as he looked down at her. "In front of every one of my guests, you just defamed an innocent woman," he said, his voice a low and menacing rumble. "You shattered a bottle that was over a century old, a piece of my family's history, and now you have the audacity to use my name to plead for your own safety." Vanessa shivered, her knees buckling beneath her. Her father moved to stand by her, his own face just as pale. "Maxwell," he began, "please remain calm. We can handle this matter in private." Vanessa is still young. She was not aware of the gravity of her actions. Max shifted his unblinking stare to George Thornton. "Mr. Thornton, I value the long years of partnership between our families, but I do not tolerate disloyalty, regardless of who is responsible. Escort your daughter from my home immediately, and we will discuss the repercussions at a later time." Tony and 2 other guards moved forward, taking hold of Vanessa's arms gently, but with undeniable strength. She fought against them, screaming a stream of profanities. "She is going to regret this!" Vanessa howled, her wild, bloodshot eyes locked on Isabella. "She is nothing but the daughter of a maid. She has no right to be standing next to you." Max paid Vanessa no mind, not even glancing in her direction. Instead, he positioned himself directly in front of Isabella, a human shield protecting her from the judgment of the room. He held out his hand, and Isabella, feeling as though she were in a trance, placed her own into his. In full view of hundreds of guests, including the most influential crime figures in New York, Maxwell Castellano raised Isabella's hand to his lips and placed a soft kiss upon her knuckles. "Anyone who insults her insults me," he declared, his voice ringing through the now silent hall. "And every person in this room knows the price of standing against me." Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes, but she fought to hold them back. She looked up at Max, into gray eyes that held an emotion she did not dare to identify. She had no idea what the future would bring. She could not know where this one single decision might lead them. She only knew that in this very moment, surrounded by a world of danger and deception, she was finally no longer alone. The party concluded much later than it was scheduled to. And yet, not a single person brought up the incident with the century-old bottle or the Vanessa Thornton scandal ever again. The official launch of Rosadoro was still considered an overwhelming success. New contracts were signed, and the Castellano family's powerful reputation remained completely untouched. When the very last guest had finally gone, Isabella found herself standing alone on the mansion's rooftop terrace, looking out at the glittering lights of the Manhattan skyline. She desperately needed some fresh air, and she needed some space to process the incredible events that had just unfolded tonight. She heard footsteps approaching from behind her, and she already knew who it was. Without even turning around, Max was standing right next to her, and for a long moment, they both just stared out at the city in complete silence. The night air carried a distinct autumn chill, and it made Isabella shiver. Without saying anything, Max took off his suit jacket and gently placed it around her shoulders. Isabella felt the urge to refuse, but the warmth it offered was too comforting, so she let it stay. "I owe you a sincere apology," Max said unexpectedly, his voice low and filled with weariness. "I should have stepped in much sooner. I never should have allowed Vanessa to take things that far." Isabella turned to look at him, her face filled with surprise. She had been expecting him to talk about the wine, or about the financial loss to his business, or really anything other than an apology. "You do not have to apologize to me," she told him. "You stood up for me in front of all those people. To be honest, I did not think you would do that." Max looked directly at her, his gray eyes seeming very deep in the faint light. "You believed I would just let them harm you." Isabella paused for a second. "I really did not know what to think. I am just very used to having to defend myself. I am not at all used to having someone else stand in front of me, just like that." Max was quiet for a long moment. He looked toward the distant horizon, his jaw flexing as if he were fighting a war within himself. "I am not a good person, Isabella," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "The things I have done are monstrous. I have ended lives, inflicted pain, and destroyed families without count." He held up his hands and stared at them with pure disgust. "There is so much blood on these hands they could never be washed clean. You should stay far away from me." Isabella just watched him. She saw the storm of agony and guilt in his eyes. She thought of her mother, who spent 20 years living in the shadow of his family. She thought of her father's betrayal, his flight, and every scar she carried, both seen and unseen. "I know exactly who you are," she replied gently. "I understand how violent your world can be, but your past is not the question here. The real question is what kind of man you choose to be tomorrow." Max stared, completely taken aback. "You are not afraid of me. My history does not repulse you." Isabella took a step forward, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. "I have been afraid for far too much of my life," she told him. "I was afraid of my former husband, afraid of my memories, and terrified of my future. But when I am near you," she paused, trying to find the right expression, "I do not feel fear. I feel protected, and that feeling frightens me more than anything else." Max raised his hand, the tips of his fingers brushing against her cheek with a touch so gentle it was barely there. "I am not worthy of you," he whispered. Isabella covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. "We all carry a past," she said, I am not in a position to pass judgment on you. What I see is a man making an effort to change, a man confronting his own inner demons. To me, that is worth more than some illusion of perfection. Max gazed at her for a long, silent moment, his eyes filled with emotions she had never witnessed in him before. Then, he bent down slowly, deliberately giving her more than enough time to move away if she wanted to, but Isabella did not move. Not. She tilted her face upward to meet his. Their first kiss was tentative and filled with uncertainty, like two people feeling their way through the darkness. Then Max drew her in tightly, holding on to her as if he feared she might just disappear, and the kiss became something fierce and desperate. Isabella wrapped her arms around his neck, absorbing his warmth, feeling the strong beat of his heart against his chest. In that single moment, everything else faded away. There was no painful history, no frightening future, just two individuals on a rooftop beneath the New York sky, holding on to one another as if their lives depended on it. When they finally broke apart, Max rested his forehead on hers, his breath warm against her lips. I will never allow anyone to cause you harm again, he promised. I do not care what it costs. Isabella smiled, her first genuine smile in what felt like an eternity. And I will stop running, she answered, no matter how perilous this life becomes. They remained in each other's embrace until the first light of dawn started to paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of pink. Two damaged hearts that had at last discovered a safe place to begin healing. The days following the party felt like a wonderful dream to Isabella. She and Max did not formally announce their relationship. Still, every single person in the grand house noticed the change, the unspoken looks, the brief touches as they passed one another in the halls, and the extended nights spent talking on the roof until sunrise. Sophia would beam with joy whenever she saw them near each other, while Maggie would just offer a quiet smile and act as if she saw nothing. Isabella was starting to think that she might have finally discovered a measure of happiness, that fortune was at last on her side, but one's past rarely lets go so easily. Later that afternoon, as Isabella was assisting Maggie with the inventory of furnishings in the formal living room, Tony came in, his expression rigid. Miss Reyes, he announced, there is a person at the main gate asking to see you. Isabella was taken aback. Who could it be? Tony paused for a brief moment. He claims to be your ex-husband, Derek Manning. The words hit Isabella with the force of a physical blow. The color vanished from her face, and her legs felt like they would give out. Derek. The name itself felt like a curse, a specter from a past she had desperately tried to bury. How had he located her? How could he possibly know she was in this place? Do not allow him inside, Isabella said, her voice trembling. I refuse to see him. Tony glanced toward Max, awaiting the order to deal with the unwanted guest. But Max's face was a mask of calm, impossible to read. Let him in, Tony, Max commanded, his voice unnervingly serene, but with a deadly edge. If he was foolish enough to walk directly into the lion's den, I want to witness the expression on his face when he understands that he will never be allowed to walk out. A short while later, flanked by two guards armed with visible weapons, Derek Manning walked into the room. He wore a smirk that failed to warm his cold, calculating eyes. Isabella turned and saw Derek standing there, in the middle of the Castellano mansion's living room. He looked exactly as she remembered him, tall and handsome with blonde hair and blue eyes, the same face that had once captivated her. But now, all she could see was the deep-seated cruelty that hid behind his charming smile. She saw the monster who had stolen 3 years of her life. How did you get past the gate? Isabella demanded, her voice sounding cold to hide the terror rising within her. Derek just shrugged and took a step toward her. I have my methods. I heard you found a new job with the Castellanos, or should I say, a new position in your boss's bed. Tony moved to intercept him, but Derek held up his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. Take it easy, he said. I only wish to speak with my former wife. Isabella felt a wave of sickness. We have absolutely nothing to discuss. Get out. Derek shook his head, his smile twisting into something menacing. Oh, I believe we do. Have you mentioned our child to your new protector? About how you got rid of it? Isabella went completely still, hot tears flooding her eyes. No, she whispered hoarsely. Please do not. Derek advanced again, raising his voice so that everyone present could hear him clearly. She was carrying my child, he declared, and she terminated the pregnancy because she did not want to have my baby. She is a killer. That is a complete lie, Isabella sobbed, tears now freely streaming down her cheeks. I had a miscarriage because you assaulted me. You kicked me in the stomach when I was 3 months along. You are the one who killed our child, not me. A dead silence fell over the room. Tony stood frozen, his hands clenched into tight fists. Maggie brought a hand to her mouth, her face a mask of pale shock. And it was in that precise moment that Max walked in. Isabella had no idea how much he had overheard, but a single glance at his expression confirmed her worst fears. He had heard every single word. Max's face was as cold as stone, but his gray eyes blazed with a level of fury she had never seen before. He walked right past Tony, right past Isabella, and came to a stop directly in front of Derek. What was that she said? Max asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Derek hesitated for a moment under the Mafia boss's intense stare, but he forced himself to remain calm. She is not telling the truth. She chose to end the pregnancy, and now she is trying to put the blame on me. Max did not reply. He simply stared at Derek for a long moment, then turned his head to Tony. Tony, he said, his voice terrifyingly steady, please take Isabella outside. I need to have a private conversation with Mr. Manning. Isabella wanted to object, to stay and prevent Max from doing something irreversible. But Tony gently took her arm and guided her from the room. The door shut behind them, leaving her to stand alone in the hallway, shaking and weeping. Roughly 15 minutes passed before the door swung open and Max walked out. His hands were clean, but Isabella could see fresh bruises across his knuckles. Behind him, 2 of his men were dragging Derek away. Derek's face was swollen and covered in blood, but he was clearly alive. He will never bother you again, Max stated. His voice was cold, but when his eyes met Isabella's, they were incredibly gentle. I presented him with 2 options. He could either leave this country and never return, or he could disappear in a more permanent way. He chose to leave. Isabella looked up at him, her vision blurred by fresh tears. You did not kill him. Max gently shook his head, using his thumb to wipe a tear from her cheek. You asked me not to, that night we were in the cellar, he said, reminding her of her request. I honored my promise. But if he is ever foolish enough to come back, I will not be so merciful a second time. Isabella wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest and sobbing. Max held her securely, pressing his lips to the top of her head. The haunting shadow from her past was finally gone. For the first time in 3 years, Isabella felt completely and truly free. A week after the awful incident with Derek, Isabella's life began to find a new rhythm. It was a normal defined by the standards of the Castellano mansion. She was no longer a temporary housekeeper, but a protected guest under Max's care. Even so, she couldn't sit still and insisted on helping Maggie with chores. Her mother, Rosa, had made a full recovery and was back at work. Max, however, had lightened her duties considerably and given her a substantial raise in pay. It felt like everything was finally settling into a peaceful place. That feeling was shattered one afternoon when Tony came into the sitting room with a grim look on his face. Sir, Tony said to Max, a man is at the main gate. He is asking to speak with Mrs. Rosa and Miss Isabella. He says his name is Ricardo Reyes. Isabella, who had been enjoying a book next to Max, went rigid. She heard the sound of shattering glass and saw Rosa frozen in the doorway, a tea tray smashed at her feet, her face ashen. Ricardo, Rosa whispered, her voice a fragile tremor. He is alive. He actually came back. Max stood and put a calming hand on Isabella's shoulder. "Do you want to see him?" he asked her softly. Isabella did not know what to say. Her father, the man who had walked out on them 22 years ago, the one who left her mother to face a crushing debt all alone. The person she had hated for most of her life was now outside, asking for them. She looked at her mother and saw something she never expected in Rosa's eyes. It was not anger. It was hope. "Let him in," Isabella finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "But if he hurts my mother again, I will throw him out myself." Tony gave a sharp nod and departed. A few minutes later, a man walked into the room. Ricardo Reyes was much older than the photos Isabella had. His black hair was gone, replaced with white. His face was a map of deep lines and age spots. His body was thin and stooped, as if the world had crushed him. But his dark brown eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes Isabella had, and they were now looking at his wife and daughter with an unimaginable sadness. "Rosa," he choked out, his voice unstable. "My daughter." Rosa stood perfectly still while tears streamed down her face. Isabella held her hand, feeling the tremors run through her mother's frame. "Why are you here?" Isabella's question was ice. "After 22 years, you believe you have any right to stand before us?" Ricardo hung his head, and his shoulders shook with sobs. "I know I do not deserve it," he said. "I ran away from my family and forced you to suffer for my own mistakes. I was a coward and a complete failure." He looked up again, his face streaked with tears. "Not a single day has passed that I did not think about you both. Not one night went by that I did not dream of Isabella as a little girl. I desperately wanted to come back, but I was afraid. I was afraid of being rejected, terrified to face what I had become. For this entire past month, I have stood in the shadows across the street from your apartment in Brooklyn, just watching the light in your window and crying alone, too ashamed to step forward until I knew I could beg for your forgiveness. Then I learned that Miguel had died. My own son needed me, and I was not there for him. I knew at that moment I could not run anymore." Isabella felt her deep-seated anger warring with another emotion she was reluctant to acknowledge. She was not looking at a heartless deserter, but at a broken man shattered by his own failures. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice much softer. Ricardo dropped to his knees. "I am asking for your forgiveness. I know I am not worthy of it, but I am begging for a chance to atone, to try and make up for the years I lost." Rosa moved toward him and knelt down beside him, her hands covering his. "I waited so long for this, Ricardo," she said through her tears. "I was so angry, but I never truly stopped loving you." Isabella watched her parents kneeling on the floor together and felt tears welling in her own eyes. She was exhausted from all the hate. She knelt beside them. "I do not forgive you yet," she said with firmness. "But I will give you a chance to prove you deserve it. Do not fail my mother a second time." Ricardo gazed up at her, weeping. "Thank you," he whispered. Max watched the scene unfold from the corner, his mind on his own father. He understood then that no family is perfect, but with love and true forgiveness, even the worst wounds might heal. 3 months passed after the day Ricardo Reyes came back. Life had transformed in ways Isabella had never allowed herself to imagine. Rosa was no longer a housekeeper. Max had promoted her to manage all the legitimate properties owned by the Castellano family. It was a position of great respect, with a salary that honored her 20 years of loyal service. Ricardo proved his sincerity through his actions. He secured a job as a carpenter in a workshop close to Brooklyn. He came home every day on time, helped his wife with dinner, and listened to all the stories he had missed for 22 years. Isabella began working at a nonprofit organization that helped women who had endured domestic violence, using her own painful history to guide others. She still lived at the Castellano mansion, but she was now there as Max's official partner. Their relationship was a secret no longer. That evening, Max invited everyone for dinner at Rosa and Ricardo's small Brooklyn apartment. Isabella was quite surprised, as Max typically hosted events at the mansion. He simply offered a mysterious smile and said he wanted a real family dinner. The little apartment was filled with warmth, the scent of Rosa's cooking, and the sound of joyous laughter. It was a type of happiness Isabella had never known. Rosa and Ricardo sat close, occasionally sharing affectionate glances like newlyweds. Sophia had flown home from college just to be there. She sat next to Isabella, talking excitedly about her law classes. Maggie was there as well, smiling while she told stories of Max's childhood that made him blush. Tony stood in his usual spot in the corner, but even his face showed a rare smile. In the middle of the meal, Max stood up and tapped his glass gently to capture everyone's attention. "I have an announcement to make," he said, his voice holding a warmth Isabella had never heard before. "I have decided to go back to medical school to finish the degree I walked away from 5 years ago." The entire table went silent for a beat. Then Sophia let out a cheer and wrapped her brother in a hug. Rosa wiped away happy tears, and Maggie gave a nod of deep satisfaction, as if she had been waiting years for this news. Isabella looked at Max, and her heart felt like it would burst with pride. He was finally chasing his own dream, the one he had buried along with his brother. "I will still be in charge of the Castellano Empire," Max continued, "but I have reorganized everything so I will have time for my studies. And more importantly," he said as he turned to look directly at Isabella, "I am trying to build a future that I can be proud of, a future that I can share with the woman that I love." Isabella felt her cheeks flush as every person at the table turned their smiling eyes toward her. After dinner, while everyone enjoyed their tea and as they spoke, Max guided Isabella out onto the intimate balcony. Far away, the lights of Manhattan created a distant glow, but this view was different. This was the world of her childhood, a quiet landscape of Brooklyn rooftops under the night sky. He squeezed her hand gently and asked, his voice low, "Are you truly happy here?" She leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace washing over her. "I never knew happiness like this was even possible," she whispered. He turned her to face him, and she saw a tenderness in his gray eyes that he reserved only for her. His voice was serious. "I am not a perfect man, Isabella. I have done horrible things, and I might have to do more to keep my family safe. But being with you makes me want to be a better person. You are the light that found its way into my darkness." Then, in a move that stole her breath, he lowered himself to one knee. From his pocket, he produced a small box covered in rich red velvet. He opened it to reveal a stunning emerald, encircled by delicate diamonds. It was simple, elegant, and perfect. "Isabella Reyes," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I do not deserve someone like you, but I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to. Will you marry me?" Isabella's eyes shifted from the brilliant gem to the powerful man now humbled before her. Her mind raced through the long, difficult road that had led to this very moment. She remembered the woman who had arrived here, escaping a life of pain and fear, and saw who she was now, standing on her own mother's balcony, completely loved and truly safe. She could feel the presence of her parents just inside, of Sophia and Maggie, the unexpected family that had embraced her and become her own. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of pure joy. Through a brilliant smile, she finally answered, "Yes, yes, I will." Max carefully slid the exquisite ring onto her finger. He rose to his feet and pulled her into a deep embrace, their kiss a sweet confirmation of all the promises their future held. Suddenly, a sound of cheering and applause erupted from inside the apartment. Through the glass doors, she could see that their family had been watching the entire time. Sophia was the first one out, throwing her arms around both of them. Rosa sobbed with happiness in Ricardo's embrace, while Maggie discreetly dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Later that night, as she lay securely in Max's arms, Looking up at the countless stars, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that a new life, a beautiful life, was just beginning. It was a story no one could have predicted. She was the defiant daughter of a housekeeper, sent to work in her mother's place. He was a feared mafia boss, a man who seemed untouchable. The first time he saw her, he was stopped in his tracks. But it was not just her beauty that captured his heart. It was the fierce courage she possessed, her genuine honesty, and a spirit that absolutely refused to be broken. In the shadows of his dangerous world, she became the one source of light he was determined to protect and never let go of. Their journey together is a testament to the idea that real love can conquer any obstacle, from differences in social status to the weight of a painful past, and even the most hidden secrets. This narrative teaches us about forgiveness, about bravery, and about love. Most of all, it gives us hope, showing that no matter how deep into darkness life may pull us, a path toward the light always exists if we have the strength to continue moving forward. To our wonderful viewers, if this story resonated with you, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel and turn on your notifications. Please give this video a like, share it with others, and we would love to read your thoughts in the comments section below. We sincerely thank you for spending your time with us. We wish each and every one of you good health, lasting peace, and true happiness. Until we meet again in the next video, goodbye. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and valuable takeaways for our audience.